Well, first of all, thanks, Peter, for inviting me to one of the last opportunities to present at your reading club. Well, I'm Gabriele Cesa. I'm a PhD student in University of Amsterdam and a research associate in Qualcomm Research Amsterdam. Today's talk is going to be about a couple of works I've done with two colleagues of mine from the University of Amsterdam, Leon Lang and Maurice Weiler. And it's going to be about equivariance, steerable finance, and symmetry in machine learning. Let me first introduce myself a bit more in detail. My background is on computer science. I studied computer science in my bachelor in Italy, and then I moved to Amsterdam to study artificial intelligence. After my graduation, I started this PhD in a collaboration between the University of Amsterdam and Qualcomm. I'm supervised by Max Welling in the University of Amsterdam. My research interest is mostly about geometric deep learning, which is this new branch of recent popular branch of deep learning that focuses on building geometric priors into machine learning models. And the idea behind this is that we usually want to leverage this prior information we have to achieve a better data efficiency and improve generalization, by having like a stronger, encoding some information we have in the model and not learn it from the data. Recently, I've also started working in the context of CRI-EM, which is like a computer vision problem similar to the multi-view reconstruction problem, where we focus on basically reconstructing 3D molecules from 2D projections, although here we have tomographic projections rather than normal images. But it is a problem with a lot of geometry, which is quite related to many computer vision tasks. So yeah, this is a couple of words about me. I will move to the main presentation. This is like about the structure I'm going to give. So the first three parts are going to just cover the idea of equivariance and symmetries, group convolution neural networks, which is like one of the main methods to achieve equivariance, and steerable finance, which is a later development of group convolution neural networks. And finally, I'm going to focus in the second part of the talk on our work on EN equivariant steerable finance. Okay, so first of all, let's focus on equivariance. To talk about equivariance, we talk about symmetries. In machine learning, it's common for tasks or data to present a certain symmetries. Think about in computer vision, when you have local patterns in natural images, this can appear in different location of the image, and therefore we want to process them and detect them at each position. That is the idea behind convolution neural networks, which are translation equivariant and exploit this translational symmetry. There are other types of symmetries, for example, in satellite data or medical data, where the images we have don't have a preferred orientation, so they can appear in arbitrary rotations. For example, you can see this satellite image, right? That could be in any rotation depending on how the satellite was moving over the Earth. So we would like to exploit this information, and we would like also our model to perform equally well when it sees rotated version of the same image, because they are equally likely. One last example is that of reflections. In natural images in nature, there are many patterns that have this natural mirroring symmetries, or they are symmetric under this vertical axis. And also these kind of symmetries can appear, if they don't appear at the global scale, they can also appear still at the local scale. So if you look at this image, while it's not globally symmetric to rotations, the local patterns, so if you look at the flowers, they are symmetric under rotations. So okay, the idea of equivariance now is that given this prior knowledge about the symmetries of the data we are using, we want to build it inside our neural network such that our method is able to generalize over symmetric versions of the same input without having seen that before. So we want a neural network that is trained only on, I don't know, some medical images, and it's able to generalize over rotated versions of that. So how do we do that? Let's start from a very simple example, which is that of the simplest neural network, a multi-error perceptron. a multi-layer perceptron, we can train it on the image on the left, right, to predict the, I don't know, the class probability of what animal is that, right? But if we now test it on this image, which is a translated version of the previous one, the MLP needs to learn from scratch that this is also, say, a lizard, right? And the MLP will need a larger training set to be able to generalize over these two images. And fortunately, we invented convolutional neural networks, which are translation invariant. That means that a convolutional neural network is going to approximately predict the same class probabilities for these two versions of the same image. Convolutional neural networks are actually not only invariant, but are equivariant due to the use of convolution. Imagine that instead of doing classification, we do segmentation. If you feed the translated versions of the same image in your segmentation model, you're going to get in output translated versions of the same segmentation mask. Unfortunately, convolutional neural networks are not, for example, rotation equivariant. So if we feed a rotated version of our input image, the convolutional neural network will behave like the MLP did before with the translations. Our convolutional neural network needs to see rotated versions of the image in the training set to be able to generalize over them. To convince you of that, we can also look at an example of output from a convolutional neural network. Here we have like an image, we feed a rotated version of the same image in a simple convolutional neural network. And in the center, we show the heat map of one of the channels. And we see that while it looks like the feature is kind of rotating, it's also deforming and transforming in unpredictable ways. On the right, we see a stabilized version, so rotated back, and we see that this is not stable at all. So, okay.
Rotated back means the other direction?
Yeah. Yeah, so basically, we have the input, right, it's rotating. This is the output produced. Now we take the output and we rotate it back by the same angle. So if the network would be invariant, right, we would expect the stabilized view to be stable, right, not rotate anymore. But what you see is that it's actually, there's some other transformation happening that is not just a rotation. Okay. Yeah, please feel free to interrupt me. So, okay, we understand that equivariance is important. We would like to achieve it, but how do we do that? So before, right, we moved from MLP to convolutional neural network by using convolution, and convolution allowed us to become equivariant to translations. So we can now exploit the same idea to get equivariance to a larger number of transformations. So let's briefly recall what is a convolution. We view convolution as a form of template matching, right? When we have an input image F, a filter K, right? We basically take our filter K, we show it here, and we just apply it over the image at different, after translating it with the different shifts. And for each translation of the filter, we register a different activation that produces basically a new image, right? We have a new activation for each translation of the filter. And now generalizing this further than translations is not that difficult from a theoretical point of view. We just need to replace this delta x with a more generic set of transformation. So rather than just applying translated versions of the same filter, we can apply rotated version of the same filter, mirrored versions of the same filter, and the idea is pretty much the same. Then we store an activation not only for each translation, but also for each rotation, for example. I'm not going to define precisely what a group is, but very informally, you can imagine a group being a set of transformations or a set of elements together with a way to combine them to generate new elements that are inside this set. So imagine that you can combine translations with translations, rotations with rotations to get new rotations, or also a translation and a rotation that gives you yet another type of transformation. Okay, so we can again visualize this, and we can now run this convolution with the same filter K, right? And they're going to apply it as before, right? We're going to apply different translated version of this, and we get a new response for each of them, right? Over these two axes. But we can also rotate the filter, right? And get a new response for each rotation. And we can also combine rotation and reflection, and rotations and the translations to get a new response for each rotated filter. This also provides a very efficient and simple way to implement this, because we can actually implement this as in the form of a normal conv2d from PyTorch, from TensorFlow. You can use your standard conv2d routine, but you're just going to run it, say, 4 times with a 4 rotated version of the same filter, producing not only 1 output channel, but basically 4 output channels. So you see you have like 1 channel image, you do convolution with the 4 rotated filters, and you get 4 output channels. You have to take care now of the fact that the output of this convolution is not going to be anymore the 1 channel image, right? That contains 4 channels. So the next group convolution you're going to run is not going to be anymore over like a function that is defined over just the pixels, say, but it's going to be over a function defined over the pixels and also, say, the rotations, right? Which means that in the next layer, the filter is not going to have 1 input channel, but it's going to have 4 input channels. So we can have basically in the next layer a filter that has, I don't know, some spatial resolution and also some resolution in the rotation direction, in the rotation domain. But the concept is still the same. We're going to have 4 filters now, and we are going to apply 4 rotated versions of this stack of 4 filters. So you can see that each column contains a rotated version of the previous one, and the permutation of the channels is due to the combination of rotations, but it's not extremely important for the example. Okay, so this is pretty much the idea behind the group convolution. We just need to run normal convolution with the transform versions of the filter. This works well, but we have a small problem. Like in a convolution neural network, we have to store an activation per translation, right? Here we have to store an activation per possible translation, right? Per possible rotation, for each possible transformation. And if we want to achieve now equivariance to a very large group of transformation, that gets quite computationally memory expensive, if not impossible, when the group you want to use has infinite elements. So suppose that you want to achieve equivariance to continuous rotations, right? This requires you to enumerate all infinite rotations, and that is not really feasible. To solve this problem, we rely on the framework of steerable CNNs, which are just normal convolution neural networks, which use steerable filters. Okay, so let's get into steerable filters. You may have heard the name steerable filters from the early works in computer vision from Freeman et al. Steerable filters were used, for example, for edge detection. You may have seen the directional derivatives of Gaussian filters for that, right? And the idea of a steerable filter is that a rotated version of a steerable filter, like we see on the left, can be built by linear combination of 2 other versions of the same filter at 2 other standard orientations. So, for example, the filter, let's take this filter, right? This filter rotated by theta degrees, right, can be actually built as the cosine of theta times this filter in the horizontal direction minus sinus of theta times the filter in the vertical direction. And this nice property allows us to simplify a bit our group convolution, because rather than convolving with infinitely many versions of this filter, right, every possible rotation of it, we can actually do convolution only with these 2 filters and recover the response produced by any other orientation just by linearly combining them with the right cosine and sine of theta. And let's build some more intuition behind what's going on here. So again, we take one image and we convolve only with these 2 filters. That is going to give us 2 numbers, right, for each pixel where we put the filter. So suppose we put these 2 filters, right, over this specific location of the previous image. That is going to give us 2 numbers, which we are now going to interpret as the 2 components of a 2-dimensional vector, which we kind of attach to this pixel. And the steerability property of these filters is going to guarantee that if this pattern rotates, also the output vector we generated is going to rotate around the center. That is because it's the same as saying rotating these 2 filters and rotating the input image. Okay, so now how is this vector rotating? This is just this linear combination I described before. So it's just a matter of multiplying with the right cosine and sine of theta to linearly combine these 2 numbers. And okay, now we can do one step back and zoom out and look at the full picture, if we now actually run convolution with these two filters over the full image, we are going to produce a two-dimensional vector attached to each pixel. We call this a vector feed. That is, we associate a vector instead of just one single channel to each location. And using the property we saw before, now if our image starts rotating, what happens on the right is that the output vector field starts rotating. But a vector field does not rotate only by moving the pixels around in the image, in the plane, but also by rotating the two-dimensional vectors attached to each pixel. So this is a simple example of a steerable filter. Another common example is that of isotropic filters, which are filters that are invariant under rotations. So of course, if we rotate this filter, we're going to always get the same response. In the previous case, we had to run convolution with at least two filters to get all possible responses. In this setting, we just need to run convolution with one single filter to obtain all the information we need. And what happens now is that convolution with this filter is going to produce one single channel. This channel is invariant, and as you see here, if you rotate now your input, you're just going to rotate the pixels around, but the value of the pixel is like a color that is not changing under rotations.
I have a question on the previous slide, just to make sure I understand the rotation part. If we go back one slide,
of course,
this one is also, but the other one is just more informative. This is if we're looking at if our frame of reference for the convolution, for the filter convolution, is the entire image, right? Because if we just take some small part of the image and rotate that area, just that area should be rotating and not, right?
Yeah. So this is what you say is the example I was showing here, right? Here we look at put our the center on one particular patch, right? And we look at our point of view is focused on one single pixel, right? When you look at the full picture, right? Here you have also pixels that are moving around. There's these two actions happening. One is the pixel moving around, and one is the vector rotating around its own pixel.
Okay, and where are we controlling for the pixel moving around? Is it that next slide we discussed now?
Oh yeah, we're gonna get into that later. But that is just the idea is that we have an image that is rotating. You see a rotated version of the same image, and what I'm doing now is looking at what would be the output of convolution over these rotated versions of the same image. So yeah.
Okay.
But here is a good question that's gonna come in the next slide. So what we saw now is that these are two examples of steerable filters, and we observed two different types of outputs. One is one-dimensional, one is two-dimensional. But in general, one can have more complex filters that require let's say d dimensions in output, d copies of the filter to represent all possible rotations. And that is the idea behind how we describe features in a steerable CNN. In a steerable CNN, we have some steerable filter to do convolution that produces d channels in output, and these d channels in output describe a vector field that should transform in some way, and this some way in which it should transform is made very precise by a choice of group representation. Again, I'm not going to go too much into the mathematical description of that, but you can imagine a group representation as being a way to associate invertible matrices, d by d matrices, to the elements of our group that describe how basically our channels transform when the whole image transforms. So what we saw before is that in the case where we were convolving with a isotropic filter, we were producing one single channel, right? We get an image only. And when we rotate our image, what happens is that while you move the pixels with the G, say that G is a rotation, right? That just moves the pixel in the plane. And then you transform the channel multiplying by this matrix. For the isotropic filter, the matrix is just a 1-by-1 matrix containing 1. So the channels don't change. And you just have you're just moving around RGB image, imagine, right? A grayscale image. In the case of the directional filters, what you have is that you have two outputs, right? You have two numbers in output, and this transforms using this 2-by-2 rotation matrix. And this 2-by-2 rotation matrix is what we call a representation of the group of 2D rotations. of course, like in the context, like in a CNN, you have multiple channels. As in a steerable CNN, you can have multiple copies of this representation to build a more complex or higher dimensional feature map. And the idea is that now we can, by stacking actually multiple layers of a steerable CNN, we can then achieve equivariance not only to discrete rotations, but as you can see here, to continuous rotations. Also note that with respect to the example with a conventional neural network, here in output, we don't only have a color, right? Not only this red and yellow color map, but we also have these green arrows, because a steerable CNN can also deal with other type of representations, as we have already seen. So a steerable CNN can also output vector fields directly. Okay, let's now get into how we actually build a steerable CNN, because I described how the features of a CNN look like. But the main question is, how do we build a steerable convolution? In the previous section, right, I discussed group convolution and how steerable features emerge once you use steerable filters. What I want to do now is instead changing the point of view. That is, let's say we want our input or our layers to transform like in some specific way. And the question is, what kind of steerable filters do we need to use to achieve that? So it turns out that to basically build equivariance to a group of translations and another group G of rotations, for example, it is sufficient to use a standard convolution, as we have done so far, right? With filters, let's call K our kernel for convolution, which satisfy a specific kernel constraint. This looks a bit mathematical and scary. We're going to stay at a high level, but just try to build intuition behind this constraint. What I want you to look at is that K, right, is our normal filter. Imagine that goes from our pixel grid to the number matrix with the input channels times output channels. And the constraints tells us that the filter K must satisfy this property. If we rotate our filter K, right, by G can be a rotation, it's the same as not rotating the filter at all, but left and right multiplying it with these matrices that tell us how the input vector field and the output vector field transform. And the question that we want to answer is, given this matrix rho in and rho out, right, that tells us how the input and output transform, what is the space of all possible filters that we can use that satisfy this equivariance condition? So, okay, this starts our work, which is about trying to solve this constraint in the most general possible way. If you have any doubts or questions, maybe if you want to ask them now in case, before going deeper in this, or should I proceed?
I actually, it might be coming up, but when we think about convolutions, we think about there is a small area within the larger input, and we're running a function on that small specific area.
Yeah.
Now, this is something I'm trying to figure out how it's going to work here. It's, for me, it's still not clear. Maybe we're going to be answering it soon. If we did answer and I missed it, then I would like an explanation.
Yeah, I mean, no, the idea is that we really use a normal convolution, exactly as you interpreted, right? But we're going to use filters that look, for example, like the steerable filter we saw before, right? So kind of like, imagine that you're using a directional derivative of a Gaussian filter to do edge detection, right? So the filter itself, when you place it in one particular position, is going to be rotation equivariant for rotations around that point where it's placed. But the filter does not need to cover the whole image.
So if the filter doesn't cover the whole image, but just let's say a small part of the image, and it's doing some sort of steerable convolution, so I would imagine the steering is taking part within that center of that part where the filter is looking at. And then each area around each center has its own steering convolution. And this comes back to the question with the gecko, the full gecko moving around. So that mismatch, I'm still not understanding completely.
Okay. But your intuition is quite right. Like the point is that if depends on where you put your point of view, right? Say that you look at one particular position of the gecko, right? Then you will see, and you keep track with your eyes of that position as the gecko rotates, right? You will see only a vector rotating around this point. But if you look at other parts of the gecko, right, you will see that that point is actually rotating around the image, right? So let me go back over a few slides. It's easier with a picture. So the point is that if you now look at this specific position, right? Well, you can also go to the previous slide even. So if you look at one particular point, right? Say you are focused on the hand of the gecko, right? You will see only one vector rotating, right? That's where you place these filters at one specific translation. But if you now look at the full picture where the gecko is rotating, say, around this center, right? You will see that this vector, right, is rotating around its own center, but its own center is also rotating all around.
So that's maybe my question. Where do we define the center point for the full rotation and not just for the area?
Okay, I see. It's not needed. So the point is that since you are translation equivariant, right, it does not actually matter where you define your rotation, the center of your rotation. Wherever the rotation is going to happen, right, you're going to be equivariant to that because
your translation equivariant. Yeah,
exactly.
I understood. That I didn't connect. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course, if you just want to be a rotation equivariant, that's another story, because then, being a rotation equivariant with respect to different centers of rotation involves something more complicated. But in this case, we are also translation equivariant, so you can always kind of translate back, rotate around the point that you care about, and then go forward.
Interesting.
So
yeah.
Okay, so let me jump to the right slide. Okay, so now we get into how do we solve this constraint in the most general way, and to solve it in a sufficiently general way, it's convenient to first perform some processing. That is, right now our filter looks like a matrix associated to each point, right? With the input channels times output channels. What we do is a vectorization. So we stack all the columns of this filter into a long vector. To do that, we exploit this property. If you're familiar with the Kronecker product and vectorization, you may know that the vectorization of the product of three, the vectorization of the product of three matrices can be written in this form. So you vectorize the one in the center, and you left multiply it with this bigger matrix, which kind of includes one matrix in the other. It's not too relevant. What you need to think about is that you can write this as the vectorization of the matrix in the center, left multiplied by a bigger matrix. That is all we care about. But we can now apply this on this filter and turn this from a matrix form into this vector form, where we have basically our filter vectorized on the left, our filter vectorized on the right, and it's multiplied by a bigger matrix here that somehow we did compute. And the advantage of this form is that it now requires only one matrix multiplication. It's much easier to describe, right? We have one vector, one matrix. And now what we can imagine is that rather than doing convolution with the C-in inputs and the outputs, we just do convolution with one input channel and this many output channels. We can now interpret convolution with a filter actually as a linear map. So imagine that we are given a filter. This filter maps from a function to these many output channels. I use L2Rn to refer to the space of all possible functions. That's a bit of a technicality, but what we need to care about is that the space of input signals, right? One channel input signals is a vector space. It contains vectors, right? And this convolution with the filter, right, is just a linear map that sends that takes an input function and sends it to the output channels, given a certain translation of the filter. And this happens via like a integral over the pixels, a sum over the pixel, imagine, which is just a linear map. You don't need to think this through too much. The main concept is really that our filter is nothing more than a linear map between this vector space and this vector space. Yeah, let's emphasize this again. And now we also can note that the steerable constraint we defined before is actually just looking at this linear map, okay, right, and tells us how the group acts on the input of this map, so on the functions, and how it acts on the output, so on this number of output channels. And the reason why this is very nice is that from an abstract level, right? This constraint now has this nice form. You have something like a k of g times x is equal to g times k of x, where g in both cases, the action of it is slightly different, right? Here it's acting by rotating the image. Here it's acting by rotating the output channels. But those are, in the end, linear actions and can be actually written as some form of representation. So you can imagine this is a vector with a matrix it's multiplied by, and this is some infinite dimensional vector with an infinite dimensional matrix that is acting on that. Okay, the next step to solve this constraint is by using another result from representation theory without going too much in detail. The idea is that any representation, like the ones we saw before, can be actually decomposed in a block diagonal form up to a change of basis. And the blocks in this diagonal are called, have a very specific form, and they are called irreducible representations, which are a set of representations that are very well known and they are small dimensional and that are easier to work with. We don't need to know too much about the irreducible representations and this decomposition, just that it is possible to do that. We can now approach a solution for the previous constraint by first taking the action on that we had on the left, on the input images, right? And this action, we decompose it using, in some way, we decompose this representation in a block diagonal form that basically defines many subspaces of the space of functions. This is going to make more sense in 2 steps. We do the same for the output. So the output channels, we apply some change of basis to these output channels that will decompose the action of the group in some block diagonal form. Each color here represents a different subspace which transform with some Irreps. So the representation acting here will have a block diagonal form with these colors, these blocks, and the same on the right. And the final trick is that we use a Schur lemma, which is like a standard result that tells us that there are the only equivariant maps between 2 input spaces that exist are between subspaces that are associated with the same Irrep. This sounds very technical, but the idea is really that you can do a change of basis of the input and output vector spaces, decompose them in color-coded blocks, and then you have linear maps only between blocks of the same color.
What do the colors represent again?
The colors represent, yeah, good question, represent this decomposition. So before, right, we had the row, right, is a matrix. We decomposed it with a change of basis in a block diagonal form. And each block was, each color block is one of these blocks, right? And blocks with the same color are blocks of the same type, so are kind of copies of each other. It sounds a bit complicated. It's only about, just classifying these spaces which are kind of well known.
Just to make sure that I understand, and anybody who will be listening, this means that these blocks don't have a semantic meaning per se for the type of input and output. They just have an algebraic meaning of saying this is a block within the diagonal matrix. Yeah. This is a block of the same size, right?
Yeah, like, kind of. Yeah, we will see some geometric interpretation in that in a couple of slides. But for the moment, you can imagine it really just as you have a matrix, a bunch of matrices, and you decompose them in this way. And that is the corresponding decomposition they enforce on the space where they act on the vector space they act on. But let's see now a bit more intuition on what those blocks are. And it turns out that this decomposition on the space of functions, right, it actually is given by a bunch of steerable filters, as we saw before. So before, right, we saw 2 steerable filters given by the directional derivatives of a Gaussian, right? These are, 2 functions that belong to the space of functions. They are orthogonal to each other, and together they actually span a 2-dimensional subspace of the space of all functions. And this space of function is steerable. So like every rotated version of this space is included, is like spanned by a linear combination of these 2 matrices. And that is the idea of this block diagonal decomposition. So you're going to have then some other steerable filters that generate some other 2-dimensional space, or and so on and so forth. You can use, for example, Gabor wavelets, right? And they have some different rotational frequency. For example, here you have like a frequency 1 rotations, right? But you can have frequency 2 rotations. Or you can have like a 1-dimensional space spanned by isotropic filters, because the isotropic filters are rotation invariant. So the idea is that we can start with a bunch of steerable filters to basically span our scalar filters, right? And that already give us this decomposition. So the decomposition of the space, the output space, this is a bit more technical, but you can imagine that what we do here is decomposing this numerically. We have these matrices that are given by this Kronecker product, and we can then use some numerical method to find the right change of basis that does this decomposition. And we can then kind of store this change of basis in this three-dimensional format, because it was coming from a vectorization, and that does our transforms back from our filter vectorized into like our C input times the input times the output form. And the very last step is given by, again, the Schur lemma. These linear maps between spaces of the same kind is usually contains only scalar multiples of the identity, or at most these kind of reflections. So this is known a priori. We can just, this is also vector space, and we can just parametrize it by taking learning a linear combination of these two. Okay, after this, we can actually plug everything together in our final theorem. That is a basis for the space of all G-steerable kernels is just given by taking our steerable filters, multiplying them with every possible linear equivariant map, and finally applying the last change of basis transposed that was decomposing the output channels. And of course, then you have to kind of unvectorize everything. Does that sound reasonable?
This was a full two courses of linear algebra in
Yes.
10 minutes. So not everything is entirely clear. The thing that I think for me is most important to understand is that CRJ, if it's all the linear maps, this is like an infinite amount, or if am I missing it? Is there a specific set of linear maps possible?
No, so these are all possible linear maps. Yes, that's true. Any linear combination of these is a possible linear map. So what I mean here is that the space of all possible linear maps is spanned by these two matrices. And in most of the cases, you have only the identity. In some special cases, you also have this kind of rotation. But you can imagine that for each of these, you have one free learnable parameter. And then you have another parameter for each of these colored lines. Again, this is yeah, you're right. It's a lot of linear algebra happening, but the idea is that you really can just you can build like a steerable basis for scalar filters, and then apply a bit of linear algebra to get every possible equivariant linear map. This theorem that we described is a generalization of the Wigner-Eckert theorem from Langenweiler, which previously had a similar result defined that was only working on orbits on I don't know, on circles inscribed inside a plane rather than using steerable filters over the whole plane, but they had a similar result for homogeneous spaces. Okay, so we now know like how to theoretically describe the space of all filters, but we have the requirement that we need a set of steerable filters to start from. That can be quite a complex requirement if you want to generalize to new groups, because you have to manually derive new solutions for that. Fortunately, we can exploit the property that if a filter basis is steerable for a group, it is also steerable for all its subgroups. So that means that in general, we can always choose the orthogonal group that contains all possible subgroups. It contains all the rotation and reflections, build a steerable basis for that, and then apply it for every possible subgroups we care about. And in practice, what that means is that we usually build steerable filters relying on circular harmonics or spherical harmonics. Imagine that they look like they can look like directional derivatives of Gaussians, but with also higher frequencies. You can build them also as wavelets if you prefer, or Fourier bus using Fourier bus basis. And in general, you have some freedom about the radial part. So okay, this gives us a very general way to build equivariance to translation and arbitrary groups acting on that we may care about. And that finishes the theoretical part of my presentation. And what I want to show you now is that how actually we did apply this and built a lot of different equivalent architectures by usually by using the same code and the same strategy, the same program. So what I first show you is like a big table of different equivariant architectures in the 2D setting. Here, for simplicity, we tested them on different variation of MNIST. Of course, I'm not going to go through all these results, but the idea is that we can in the same way and very easily build models that are equivariant to, well, nothing, like a convolution or a network, to discrete rotation. Cn represents n rotations, but also continuous symmetries, so like SO2. These are variants of the internal differences in the architecture, in the way you take nonlinearities, for example. We can also build equivariance to rotations and reflections. This is O2 and discretization of that. We then did the same in 3D. In 3D, we can build, like previous works did, equivariance to SO3, so 3D rotations, but also equivariance to, for example, the Platonic symmetries. So the octahedral group, that is the group of symmetries of the octahedron, or the icosahedral group, that is the symmetries of the icosahedron and the dodecahedron, but also axial subgroups, which include only rotations around the z-axis, right? Imagine this, or different type of dihedral symmetries that include rotation around the z-axis and 180 degrees rotations of the 3D space, or mirroring with respect to one axis, or inversion that gives like a number of groups that describes natural symmetries that appear also in molecules or crystals. We evaluated our models both on data that has full 3D symmetries and models and data that has only, for example, axial symmetries. And in general, we always observe that the better the equivariance of the model, the closer the equivariance of the model is to the actual symmetry of the data, the better it performs. So in this 3D setting where we have full rotations, the models that are equivalent to full rotations perform better than conventional neural networks or networks which are equivalent only to rotations around the z-axis. While in the dataset where the data has only rotation around the z-axis, the model which is equivalent only to those performs better than the one that is equivalent to full rotations. One last detail, last idea that we want to present is that of local symmetries. So it is common that data has global symmetries, like we saw before, like global rotations, but often natural images have also local symmetries. While it's true that, for example, the sky is always on top and the ground on the floor, local patterns, like, I don't know, when we look at the floor of the animal, can appear in all rotations, or the sunflower image I showed before, like local patterns can appear in all rotations. So it can be beneficial to be rotation equivariant at a local scale in the first layers of a neural network, but it's important to get rid of this invariance in the final classification task, because the sky is never on the bottom, so we don't care about classifying these images. This is an idea we evaluate on MNIST, since on rotated MNIST and transformed MNIST, since local patterns like lines can appear in every direction. But if we want to classify a digit, it's important that like the information about its orientation can be quite important. I will skip a bit faster over our results. We create a Bayesian, which is a non-equivariant CNN, which we evaluate on normal MNIST, rotated MNIST, and rotated and mirrored MNIST. We then evaluate rotation equivariant models, the blue ones, and rotation and reflection equivariant models, which are the orange ones. The N is the number of rotations we consider. Here we use a discrete group. And in general, you see that the more rotations we consider, the better our models perform up to a saturation point in the dataset that are rotated. In the dataset that is also contains reflections, the model that is reflection equivariant, the orange one, is generally performing better, but is not but is outperformed by the model that is only rotation equivariant if the data does not contain reflections. Instead, in the model that in the data that does not have any symmetries, the model that the normal CNN is actually not performing worse than any of our models. Is forming like a very strong baseline. But we can still exploit some local symmetries, as we saw before, because the local patterns do have, for example, reflection and rotational symmetries in all of these data sets. So what we do is actually, one step back. If a model that is the reason why the rotation equivariant model is not performing so well on MNIST is also, for example, for the fact that if you take a 4, right, and you rotate it, and then do a reflection, you can turn it into a 7. So being invariant to global rotation and reflections can be actually harming the performance of a model if the data does not have those symmetries. So to solve this issue, what we do is introducing this group restriction, building a network that is equivalent to rotation and reflections until some point, depending on the field of view of our neurons, right, in the intermediate layers. And then when in the higher levels, or later layers of the neural network, which are closer to the classification layer, we actually are going to be equivalent only to, say, rotations or only to translations. And with this idea, actually, we improve a lot our architectures. First, in the dataset which has only rotations, the architecture which is first reflection equivariant and then only rotation outperforms the one that is only rotation equivariant. And in the dataset which does not have any symmetry, right, the models which are equivariant, but in the very last layer get rid of the invariance to rotations, do outperform all previous architectures, including the conventional baseline.
In what cases will this type of technique actually harm the model and stuff instead of hurt it?
Well, like as in the MNIST example, right, is very extreme. Of course, like in nature, right, you would not have such a strong example. So this is more like to prove like the idea, right, that the invariance is not useful. If you process natural images, you don't have this setting where invariance is not useful. Probably is harming. At most, it's not useful, right? But you can still see it as a a trade-off between computation and channels spent for being invariant to something that is not happening, right? So it can hurt performance in the sense that you're over constraining your neural network, so it has less flexibility. And this is actually what we see. Yes, sorry.
I'm trying to think. It's not the letters that, if they're translated and rotated, they could look like other letters, and we're trying to build a model that, because on the grand picture is relevant for the direction is relevant in the grand picture in the beginning. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking these things could be similar if we're looking at photos actually of sky. If you want to recognize patterns of stars, maybe, or maybe even, I don't know if there are any around, but like biomolecular level images or graph versions of molecules. So this is where we also need this type of work where the rotation or the reflection have a meaning. And this is where we want to keep that.
For example, a place where this can make sense is if you're processing like very big protein chains, right? And usually what you have is that you have a main backbone, right? That kind of defines a global orientation. It's like saying the sky and the floor, right? But then around this backbone, right, you have some rotational invariance or rotational symmetry, right?
Local.
Yeah, because like I don't know, the chains attached to the backbone can kind of rotate kind of freely around this backbone. So while it's true that you have theoretically like a global 3D rotational symmetry, you can always find the backbone and kind of align around that. But you still have this local SO2 symmetry, right? Rotational symmetry that you can exploit. So that is something that can be relevant also in the computational chemistry setting. Where we tested this for simplicity is in the setting of natural images. Well, first on MNIST, and we see that even like in the more complex experiments we run, we get a state-of-the-art using this group restriction. But apart from the less interesting MNIST results, what is interesting is that you can actually apply it on a bit more realistic data. We try it on CIFAR 10 and 100 and on STL10, which include low resolution, a bit higher resolution and natural images. And there we actually see that taking like a standard convolutional neural network, adding equivariance, and using this restriction design gives the best performance. So for example, on STL10, which is probably more interesting since it's a higher resolution, we have that the model that is equivalent. The standard baseline gives us this 12% of test error. Adding equivariance brings this down. Like STL10 has only global mirroring symmetry, right? This gives us so if you have equivalent to this, we achieve 11% of test accuracy of test error. But if we also add a rotational equivariance in the first layer, So D8 and D4 is a rotation equivariance. There's equivariance to 8 and 4 rotations plus reflections. And only in the end, we are equivariant to only reflections. These give us a much better performance, bringing this down to 10% of error. So yeah, this is the conclusion of my talk. In summary, like we basically provide a theoretical analysis of the space of all steerable filters, which can be used to generate very flexibly many types of steerable shenanigans. Our was not only a theoretical work, but we actually implemented all the theory I described so far in the form of a library, which you can use to implement on your own all these methods. The application of this work can actually go further than the simple images or voxel grids I described. It can actually be used via the framework of gauge shenanigans, if you've ever heard it. Can actually be used to run convolution not only on Euclidean spaces but over manifolds, or the framework of steerable shenanigans can also be extended to homogeneous spaces in a kind of similar way. Finally, with the trick of group restriction, we can also push further the framework of steerable shenanigans to partial equivariance, where we are equivariant to local symmetries, and then throughout the network we can adapt to the symmetry of the field of view of the scale seen by the neurons at each layer. So yeah, this is the conclusion of my talk. Thanks for your attention. And yeah, please ask me any question, any doubts.
We had Sarah also. I think she had a question before, but I wasn't sure. Sarah, if you do have, it's a good time to ask.
Yeah. Hi. So first, thanks for the talk. This is great.
Thanks.
I was interested about kind of an interpretation of this as a restriction on the space of all linear filters that can be applied. And sort of, so you kind of answered this in the second half in terms of like kind of what's the dimension of that space. But I noticed at the end when you were comparing your networks with different, the different kind of restrictions on rotation symmetries, that the number of parameters actually increased.
Yeah,
so are we making a larger network or?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in general, right, if you just take it as it is, right, and you restrict it, you of course lose number of parameters, right, because you're working in a lower dimensional space. So for a comparison, like what is common to do is generally, to scale up your model in number of channels to achieve the same number of trainable parameters. That is quite convenient because, like in these experiments I was showing, we did not perform a hyperparameter search. So we took like a model, this wide ResNet, that was pre-trained, like was given by previous works. We took the architecture, the hyperparameters, and we rerun it with an equivariant design. But learning rate, all these parameters are very dependent on the number of actual learnable parameters. So there's no it's hard to generalize them easily. So if you actually scale up the number of channels a bit to match approximately the same number of parameters, those hyperparameters are much easier to generalize. We actually have the two, if you look, we have a couple of baselines with this star. One model, right, has the same number of parameters, and the other has a lower number of parameters. And the difference is that we try both approaches, right? One model is actually scaled up to match the number of learnable parameters, while the other one is actually not, such that, yeah, you have both comparisons. But what we see is that in both cases, we improve over the original baseline. Of course, if you scale up as the model, you have as an additional advantage given by the additional number of channels.
Okay, cool. And I wonder, kind of related to that, can you comment on kind of what the scope of that restriction is as you increase the rotation, the like kind of number of discrete rotations?
You're talking about the number for restriction in the number of parameters, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it depends what kind of architecture you use, because I did not put a lot of emphasis today on the detail of how these architectures are built. I just described in general how these linear layers work, but there's a lot of difference in how the nonlinearities are applied in practice. So, and that depends a bit on how you scale this up. It's common when you just have a group convolutional architecture, right? Like the first ones we described, to count the channels, right? I don't know, over just as an independent dimension, right? So now if you actually increase the number of rotations, they just linearly increase the number of channels. And therefore, when you then look at a linear layer, that increases quadratically because you have it both in input and in the output. That is not really used because it's quite expensive. Of course, if you take a normal CNN, which is already quite wide, and you now make it n times wider because you want to be equivalent to n rotations, that is not going to scale up very well. It's going to require a lot of memory. What is common to do to keep the number of parameters is scaling it up by square root of n, right? So if you have n rotations, then you divide by square root of n the number of channels, such that the product, taking the product, the number of channels, the number of parameters in the filter is approximately similar. But that still has some overhead. That is what you see in these models that have the same number of channels, the same number of parameters, right? On the other hand, what you can have is the model that is not scaled up, right? So you have a normal CNN, right? And you just restrict the number of learnable parameters. So at that point, increasing the group size, right, is just going to have an effect on the number of learnable parameter, but not on the number of channels, on the computational complexity. We did some bit more detailed experiments in the 3D setting here. Let me roll back to the previous slide. So all architectures we described here have approximately the same architecture, so exact number of channels and operations. And what changes is only the equivariance constraint applied. So what you see is that, for example, when you go from a normal convolutional neural network, which has all 3 parameters, and you go to SO3, you lose some expressivity, of course, because like the model is smaller, right? Relatively smaller. If you imagine it as a group convolution, you're kind of moving the channels dimension inside the group dimension to make up for the constraint that you have, fixed number of memory, fixed number of computations. To kind of give an overall answer, I don't think there's like a common, like a one standard choice in the community. Usually you kind of compare with all methods, and in practice, the equivariant neural networks give better results even if you don't increase the number of channels. But because of weight sharing, they can also afford being trained at larger widths, and still achieve like much better results. So you can try to start with a model that has the same computational cost, get an improvement, and trying to tune it at larger width to achieve better results. Sometimes with the CNN, there's so much that you can do in width right before you start encountering the trade-off between expressivity and generalization.
Cool. Thank you.
I think, like, I have out of curiosity though, but I can't ask this question well, so I'm wondering if I should ask it or not. When you developed the G-steerable kernels theorem, what was like? Did you have a moment when you found out something like that made you be able to develop that theorem, or was it just straightforward for you?
No, of course. I mean, this work, right, is like a result of actually a long line of works, right, that started back in time with the original steerable finance. Then there were other works that proved that this constraint is not only sufficient, it's also necessary, right? So there were many works that led to this theoretical description of why this is what we care about. Then, as I said, this is a generalization of the previous work from Lang and Weiler, which are my other 2 co-authors, which had a weaker version of this theorem that was working only on subspaces. So you had to work by kind of splitting, say, your image in many rings, and then you would parameterize each ring independently, and then you would have to stitch them together. That is kind of working with the rotation, but if you have other groups, it becomes challenging because you have to plug together many points. And the realization for us was, well, it's quite technical, but
let's try to see how technical I can get. Go ahead.
Well, you can kind of generalize the theory from Lang and Weiler was relying on some standard results from representation theory and harmonic analysis over groups, which is very hard to generalize further than that. but the main idea is very related to some concepts. I don't know, with Fourier transform, you can kind of imagine that what we are doing is some kind of Fourier transform. You can do that over the orbits of a group, right? Over basically circles. It's hard to do it over like a plane if you're acting with rotations, because if you're familiar with it, there's some theorem that tells you that a rotation of a function, right, is equal to a rotation of its Fourier transform, right? So if you now look at a Fourier transform of a function, right, you will have to kind of combine all possible frequencies in the same circle, right? That leads to a complex formulation. While if you just look at a Fourier transform over a circle, right, and you now rotate the circle, right, it's just about rotating each frequency independently. So that's what was happening before. That's why they focused only on this setting of parameterizing each circle independently. And the realization for us was really that while people worked on steerable filters for a long time, and the steerable filters are really giving us this decomposition of the input functions that is equivalent to what the Fourier transform over the circle is giving us. Like you have basically these subspaces in the Fourier transform. They are just one complex number that are transforming independently. We just had to note that the steerable filters are giving what we need, but a bit beyond the simple circle, but over the whole plane.
Yeah, cool, very interesting. I think I'm done with my questions. Sarah, if you have anything more, please do. Otherwise, we're actually good on time. I thought it would be shorter, but like we're good, exactly. So
I hope I was on time with my presentation. Maybe took a bit longer.
Yeah, this was actually a quick presentation, but we had a lot of discussion also going.
Okay.
Gabriel, thank you for this talk today.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I hope that this was not too I don't know, mathematical, too technical. It was able to convey some intuition behind it. So.
We had both. And the recording will have chapters so people could skip the parts that are more relevant for them, and also maybe rewatch the technical parts again and again. So I think the structure was good for our audience. Sarah, thank you for joining today. Gabriel, also again, thank you for the talk. Sure. And I will wish everybody a great day. Thanks. And a good evening.
You too, and thanks again for the invitation. Bye-bye.